Hi, this is Jonathan Armstrong from Caudry, the specialist compliance law firm. I'm pleased to say that Eric Sinrod is with me live from the US, or sort of live. And Eric, we're going to expand on one of the topics that we talked about in our last TechLaw10 film, and that's about the war in Ukraine. And unfortunately, things have developed since we last chatted.
Yeah, so I want to talk about cyber warfare and give a little background and lead to that point. I mean, as we know, the internet over the past couple of decades has been expanding in terms of its applications and uses. And there's been concern rightly that the internet might be a means of waging war or dismantling the means of waging war by others. And as an example, I'm sure you know about this, Jonathan, some years back, Stuxnet, a computer worm, was launched reportedly by a U.S. and Israeli intelligence operation to attack and cause the tearing apart of programmable logic controllers of Iranian centrifuges that were designed for potential nuclear weapon purposes. So that happened. Also, U.S. officials reported a few years ago that Russia initiated a sophisticated cyber attack on the Pentagon's Joint Staff Unclassified Email System. An email system was taken down for a couple of weeks, and this impacted about 4,000 personnel employed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A month before that, the Office of Personnel Management here in the US reported that a database housing personal information relating to roughly 4 million current and former employees had been hacked. And this was reported to be the work of the Chinese government, even though the administration did not directly accuse China, but that was implied. Then, I know you've heard about this one, there was the hack of the Ashley Madison website, the world's largest adultery site. They say on the site, life is short, have an affair, and the personally identifiable information of millions of people were hacked, not necessarily by a foreign government, but thousands of users of that site had .gov email addresses, and apparently some of them were being extorted to provide state secrets in return for not being outed publicly for, having potentially, extramarital relations vis-a-vis that site. Now, these hacks did not cause physical harm as in traditional warfare, but if governments can obtain sensitive information so easily, it might not bode well. And it's depressing to think that Russia and China might be able to disrupt or gain control over nuclear power plants, air traffic control, the electrical grid, the water supply and distribution, and the list goes on. And we definitely could suffer real physical and other harm. Now, you mentioned Russia and Ukraine. There's strong evidence tying Russian hackers to a string of attacks in Ukraine, going back to 2015, actually, when these hackers knocked out electrical power to about 250,000 customers in Western Ukraine. The next year, targets included government agencies and the banking system. And before Russian troops recently invaded, Ukraine was hit with never before seen malware designed to wipe data. So Ukraine is a desirable target for testing cyber war capabilities. Why? Because the country has a similar infrastructure as that found in Western Europe and the US, but the main difference is that Ukraine has fewer resources to counterattack. Now, the US government, Jonathan, has been wary about the possibility of a Russian cyber attack on US critical infrastructure, with very Kremlin attempts to spread disinformation about any incident's effects, all to sow panic among Americans. And here's a quote for you, quote, all businesses, all critical infrastructure owners and operators need to assume that disruptive cyber activity is something the Russians are thinking about and they are preparing for, close quote, as stated by Jen Easterly, and she's the director of the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, CISA, not our CIA. And she pointed to the example of the cyber criminal attack on the Colonial Pipeline last year in the US, which shut down delivery of fuel to the East Coast for days and led to Americans hoarding gasoline. And the Biden administration for a while has warned that Moscow could respond to US sanctions over Russia's invasion of Ukraine with cyber attacks on US infrastructure, or that ransomware gangs like the ones that hit Colonial Pipeline could lash out. Agencies like the CISA and the Departments of Treasury and Energy in the United States in recent months have held cyber threat briefings on Russian hacking capabilities against America's biggest banks and electrical utilities. And many of those critical infrastructure operators have spent years investing in network defense and studying high-profile Russian cyber attacks like the one I mentioned that cut power to 250,000 users in Ukraine. So, Jonathan, an open question is whether cyber attacks against the US or, say, the UK or Europe could lead to an actual physical war. And some experts believe that if cyber attacks led to significant death, destruction, or injury, like that might result from missiles and bombs and bullets, such cyber attacks could be considered use of force under international law that could trigger an actual war. So imagine a cyber attack that targeted a major dam or air traffic control towers that led to tremendous death or destruction. This might be considered the stuff of real war. Or what if Amazon, Google, and Microsoft cloud services went offline? Would that trigger a war? Well, this would mean that our economies would stop working. In this day and age, when the internet does not work, we're back in the dark ages. So I'm almost done. But what about cyber attacks on other NATO countries? Like, it's not the US or the UK, but it's another NATO country. Under Article 5 of the NATO Charter, an attack on one is an attack on all. So would the US or the UK get involved if there's a cyber war against another NATO country? And then finally, before I turn it over to you, among the many issues to think about, it's worth noting that our FBI advised prior to the administration's recent Russia cyber attack warning that hackers associated with Russian internet addresses have been scanning the networks of 5 US energy companies in a possible prelude to hacking attempts. So I know I jammed a lot in there. I apologize. But Jonathan, here's my ultimate question. Should we be afraid? Should we be very afraid?
I think we should certainly be afraid, and I think we should certainly be cautious. And that was a great tour around the whole area, I think. I wanted to start my remarks by saying that, of course, our hearts go out to the Ukrainian people in these horrendous times. I've been privileged to have helped the Ukrainian Bar Association in some of their efforts. On Friday, I was with the President and the Secretary General of the Ukrainian Bar Association, and they are doing incredible work and being incredibly dignified at this very difficult time. In some respects, I think that the online war has been similar to the offline war, the conventional war, and then in some respects, I think it's been different. I think as far as the similarities are concerned, then in some respects, I think Ukraine has done better than people anticipated. And just as we've seen those problems with conventional war that the Russian military have had, 40-year-old tires on missile launchers that, surprise, surprise, have punctured, an inability to be as efficient as predicted in terms of waging war. I think we've seen the same in terms of the cyber war as well. I think I'm not underestimating the attacks on Ukraine. I know Microsoft said at the end of April that they think they've detected some 40 attacks on Ukrainian targets. They've been phishing attacks, misinformation attacks, data seizures, the destruction of critical systems. And I know that's been fairly widespread in terms of infrastructure across Ukraine. I was emailing a Ukrainian official who told me he was unable to reply because their network was down. And I know that as well as government systems, there have been attacks on nuclear energy, media, logistics, and agriculture. So I'm not underestimating the scale of the cyber attacks on the Ukraine. But in some respects, I wonder if they have been less effective than people might have thought. You know, Ukraine is still able to communicate. I know that some people have left Ukraine because internet connections are unreliable, because it's difficult to predict what will be up and when. But we know that systems have not quite suffered as much as possible. And we also know that the Ukrainian battle efficiency has been lessened by some of the communication difficulties that they have had. And there are emails that look to be authentic from FSB officials, for example, complaining that the war hasn't gone the way it should have done in terms of cyber warfare and communications. At the same time, we've had a group of almost cyber vigilantes, you might say, anonymous, that loose collective of hackers being one and marshalling some, and there are other groups as well. And these cyber vigilantes have sided with Ukraine and attacked Russian targets. So we've seen attacks on the media regulator Roskomnadzor, for example, which have included the reports made by that agency to the FSB, which have given indications of the prods that the media agency seem to have had from Kremlin on what is and is not permitted to be said, and who's saying things that the administration in Russia would rather they didn't. We've also had attacks on VGTRK, which exposed some 20 years worth of emails. And I think Russian civilians have been victims of this as well. I saw one report, for example, that said that the number of Russian leaked email addresses doubled in March. And for context, that makes Russian leaked email addresses the most populous of those that are being leaked by various gangs on the internet. And there are 5 times more Russian compromised email addresses in March than there were in January. So just as you're saying about these attacks like Ashley Madison, then I think there is a whole cyber vigilante group that are seeking out Russian email addresses and exposing them as well. So in some respects, I think that's almost followed the pattern of the conventional war, if you like, with Russia perhaps not being as efficient as predicted, and various people from other nations coming to aid Ukraine. But the other similarity, it seems to me, is that Russia is still attempting what you might call cyber carpet bombing. So just as it has launched these indiscriminate and despicable attacks on cities, it's also launched or condoned cyber attacks on a whole range of targets who are targeted only because they're in the West, not because they've played any active role in Ukraine's defense. And a number of our clients have suffered from those attacks, and we've made a number of reports to regulators under GDPR when clients have been caught in the crosshairs of those attacks. And as I've said before, I think on these podcasts, if you think that some logic is applied to these attacks, you're wrong. We've seen before that Keith Chegwin, a quiz show host in the UK, was attacked a long time ago because he was perceived to be an agent of the US government. That obviously wasn't the case. And there is no sort of sanity threshold applied to a lot of these attacks. So unfortunately, almost every corporation, almost every organization is vulnerable either to attacks from Russian threat actors or from cybercrime gangs that are being shielded or encouraged by the Putin regime. And we've seen a lot of press, for example, around the Conti gang, again, a loose collective rather than a crime gang in a conventional sense, who first of all said that they were going to Putin's aid. And then it turns out some of the gang were Ukrainian. They didn't like that, and they exposed source code and emails relating to the gang. But just as it's like whack-a-mole, just as you knock one down, then there are another two gangs coming up to replace them. So we've certainly seen attacks on corporations. And of course, one of the real issues there is that your risk doesn't change and your opportunity to ensure that risk does. So, for example, if you do have a cyber attack on your systems, then you still have GDPR responsibilities in the EU. There's a recent case against Tuckers, for example. A lot of these cyber attacks still exploit common vulnerabilities. So patches that you haven't applied, MFA that you haven't applied across your multi-factor authentication, haven't applied across your estate. And you're still likely to be fined if the attacks get in through those known vulnerabilities. We've talked about class actions before. Class actions are on the rise. There will be class actions against organizations that have been attacked as a result of this war. And of course, your ability to insure yourself decreases. We've had a number of cases, I know in the US, where insurers have said, well, attacks like this are acts of war. They're not covered by your cyber insurance, so you're on your own. So for organizations, the risks are the same or greater, and their chances of mitigating those risks through insurance are greatly reduced. So it is a difficult time for all sorts of different people in the world at the moment. I don't want to undermine the plight of the Ukrainian people who are front and center in this horrific conflict. But most organizations in the West are vulnerable to these cyber attacks as well, and need to do all they can to try and prevent them.
So many important points there, Jonathan. Obviously, we have a limit on time. I'll just respond just ever so briefly. Yeah, I mean, I sort of set out a potential parade of major horribles.
Yeah.
And that would suggest, and I asked the question, should we be afraid? Should we be very afraid? And you pointed out difficulties and problems we're facing that would cause us to be afraid. But do we get to the point of being very afraid? I was sort of thinking about, I mean, you were talking about threats and issues being faced by organizations and companies right now. And of course, my heart does go out to the people in Ukraine in this horrendous situation. But are we getting to the point where cyber warfare is tantamount to actual warfare? And it seems like, at least so far, as you pointed out rightly, the greatest fears haven't been realized. We're not seeing mission critical systems going down, the air traffic control systems going down, the electrical grid going down, death and destruction and mayhem, things like that. Fortunately, we don't know, of course, what's been thwarted, that was incoming, if you will. There's probably some information we're just not privy to, but the ultimate nightmare scenarios have not been happening in the big picture, if you will, where cyber warfare is almost equivalent to actual war as causing actual physical destruction and violence. But as you say, there's still all kinds of problems happening as a result of all of this. And it's not tremendously organized, but it can definitely redound to the detriment of businesses, governments, and individuals. Am I capturing things properly?
I think so. I think that's exactly right. And perhaps we should congratulate those who have been involved actively in defending both Ukraine and other nations, and the NCSC in the UK, for example, have done good work in addition to those US agencies that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And that's probably about all we've got time for. So do you want to give your contact details? And of course, as ever, we'll put them below the screen if you're watching us on YouTube. Yeah,
my name's Eric Sinrod. I'm in the San Francisco office of Dwayne Morris. My email is ejsinrod, EJSINROD, at Dwayne Morris, DUANE, Morris.com.
And I'm Jonathan Armstrong, so that's jonathan.armstrong@corderycompliance.com. We'll put those contact details in the screen below if you're watching on YouTube. If you do like this little film, then do subscribe either to the podcast or to the YouTube film. And we look forward to speaking to you again in a few weeks' time.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.